This video is a supplement to kind of explain how we can use RGB values to establish saturation. Now, this is not an ideal method. I would not recommend this method for anybody in color theory. Unfortunately, with assignment 3, depending on what you want, we want to have our ability to pick whatever colors. So it's not a system where we can kind of restrict this. So when you come to your critique, you may need to be able to deal with a situation where the saturation isn't clearly defined as one higher or lower. And if you choose to kind of deal with that, this would be one way to approach those changes in saturation. So let's talk a little bit about how RGB values identify saturation. When we look at grays, and we've talked about this previously, it's when all three are equal. So here, obviously, 166 we see, 99, and as they go lower, they're darker in value. As they go higher, 196 across all three here, it's getting lighter in value. White being 255, black, if I could grab one somewhere, I don't think there's one in this file, you're going to see is 0. So when there's no difference between these values, this is when it's something that's completely desaturated. When we have something that's fully saturated, and full saturation would be this at 255, and let's go ahead and just move it up for you. This is the greatest range in these RGB values that we've been working with, from 0 to 255, and that's full saturation. And that's the greatest range. So as this range decreases, that's a decrease in saturation. So we can compare any two colors, their RGB values, and that range between the two, and get a sense of the saturation. So let's use this example here before looking at it in HSB. And you may recall, this is an example we've already looked at, so you may recall what the saturation is. You may see what the saturation is, but we're using this example because it's clear and to explain why it works for other situations. So looking at this right center, and let me bring up a calculator because we're going to do this real easy. 218, that's the highest value, minus the lowest value, 65. Our difference there is 153. So that's our range in these RGB values. Looking at the left here, bringing up the calculator one more time. Here we can see our highest number is 243, minus our lowest one, 49, and we're going to get 194. So this, based on what we've talked about, this left one should be a higher saturation. So let's go ahead and look at it in HSB. And what we see is those S&B values are 80 and 95% respectively. On the right, they're 70 and 85%. So this is where we talked about that clear difference in saturation in the earlier supplements. But here we can see again that the RGB values, this higher range shows that this is a higher level of saturation, that 194 units of difference that we looked at here. When we go to the right here, we can see the lower saturation, that 153 units of difference. When we look at the fully saturated, and this is where that was 254, not 255, well, there's our one we were missing. So in the full saturation, that's that range from 0 to 255. So those are things to look at when we're talking about saturation. Now we can deal with this in much more complex situations, but I think it's better to kind of ease into this if we want to have this discussion. My thoughts are, and as I mentioned in the previous supplements, it is best to kind of avoid this route if we need to evaluate saturation, but we also want to evaluate our colors accurately. And if we have things that are very similar, we need to kind of deal with that. And this would be one approach to being able to identify the saturation of any color without having to depend on S&B values, which is a much less precise method. Unfortunately, how do we compare something that's 1157 against say 20 and 19? These are both low levels of saturation. This is probably going to be less saturated, but what if we kind of raise this up, or what if we just kind of start switching things, and they're all very close, but there's not that clear difference that we've talked about. And I think that's the question that you may run into at some point, is how to identify saturation when there's not that clear difference in S&B values. And what we've learned, if we've learned anything at this point, is that perception isn't always going to identify a color for us precisely. And so these RGB values are one way to kind of get around that limitation and be able to get a precise answer about the saturation. So if there's questions about this, let me know. We'll go about it a little bit further.